All right, so how many engineers do we have in the room? All right, how many cyber people? Who thought engineers would be humorless, right? Because Ginger put C2 as a starting point of her consequence analysis. I thought that was so funny. And then she ended up with a QR code, so to boot. All right, folks, so we're going to talk about resilience. I guess when I put this together, I didn't realize this whole conference was going to be so much resilience focus. It's amazing, right, to see everyone kind of talking about similar things and focusing on the same things. Yesterday's MITRE panel was amazing in that the exercise kind of proves some of the items we're going to talk about. So a little bit about myself. I was an engineer and I did talk past cyber people. So I think Ginger was spot on. We rarely ever had to engage with the cyber people, right? Because you're focused on controlling things. I was a gas turbine controls engineer for GE for many years, then eventually became a sales guy for them, selling control system upgrades, and got into cybersecurity through those things, right? So I was doing power, oil, and gas. And of course, now I work for a company called Frenos. We do OT risk assessments. I've always been fascinated that we had these resilient systems before digital existed, right? We kind of screwed the pooch, pardon my language, for not talking to cyber and risk people by adding controls and digital technologies when the previous technologies were probably a lot more resilient and a lot more, obviously, cyber-proof, right? However, they were not accurate, they were not precise, so there were other reasons, efficiencies. I always used SRE, safety, reliability, efficiency, and some people use performance like Ginger mentioned, but yeah, this is not new, folks. We've always known about resilience, but we just never focused on it from a cyber standpoint. So I just put a quick summary of the State of the Union so that we kind of know. I'm not sure if we can read it because it's pretty small print. I'll talk through some of the main items, right? So probably not surprising for you all, OT security is still not where you think it should be, right? Because one, unlike safety or quality, security is not a natural thing for a lot of OT people, right? When you say OT, by the way, the traditional industrial control system operators, control instrumentation technicians, none of them relate to it. OT is a term that was given to them by IT because it wasn't IT, right? It's some kind of technology that's used in the space. It's not IT, so let's call it something, right? Instead of asking them what they would prefer, they just came up with a name, right? Or maybe Gartner did. But either way, OT is not something they relate to. However, the industrial control systems people historically had focused on safety, have quality and other reliability is another thing. Those were the things that mattered to them, right? Not security. So that hasn't changed fundamentally. Like we haven't trained people on security as we did on quality or safety, right? That hasn't changed. And then the biggest stakeholders, not just the controls or instrumentation people, but also the operators, the maintenance people, the plant managers, they're not savvy in security, right? Again, because they historically focused on improving their processes, their plant operation. So it wasn't a big focus for them to think about security. The worst that we did to ourselves was that the newer OT security or OT deployments still don't have a focus on security. Because, I mean, think about, and I worked in the LNG space quite some time. If you're building a brand new LNG plant, right, it costs multiple billions of dollars. The last time you put a package together, it took 5 years to develop the feed and 5 more years to put the plant together. And after 10 years, you got something going. What's the best thing you can do? Copy, paste, right? You just replicate what was done already and then, get your procurement to task to say, hey, go negotiate it. You spent $2 billion last time, get it to us at 1.7 now, right? If you're doing that, you literally are not changing a thing, right? Which means that newer OT security developments are not part of the discussion. So that's been a consistent problem for us. And then years of neglect. Again, it's probably at this point not that surprising to you that we just neglected security. We did compliance when we had to, right? Obviously, NERC-CIP in the power sector, more recently TSA. for oil and gas pipelines and transportation in general. We do what we have to, but we didn't really focus on security because we didn't have to, right? The various functions, IT, networking, OT, right now don't have a collaborative process. We just talked about how we talk over each other, which means that we don't have the same priorities, right? So we just keep on talking about what's important to us, and there is no easy way to collaborate among these different groups. And then, of course, the boards and leadership, let alone cyber, right? I mean, think about a typical board composition. They got finance people, they got legal people, they got HR. They didn't have cyber to begin with, let alone OT cyber, right? So OT cyber is just one piece of the puzzle. It is probably the most important piece because it impacts operation, impacts production, impacts revenue. However, it's not part of the discussion at that level. And then this is the doing of the vendors and the OT security space, this last space, which is about outcomes being unclear, right? Let's say you work really hard, convince your leadership to invest money in OT security, you put a project together, you are somehow being able to demonstrate value, right? You buy all these tools and you implement, a security solution. Historically, at least in the past decade, the outcomes have been very unclear, right? Number one is most people start with the technology. I mean, you have this shiny new gadget and you buy this and you want to solve something. OT security is not that easy. I mean, like Ginger showed before, there's a lot of engineering, there's a lot of process, right? A simple tool or a single gadget is not going to solve all your problems. So it's not very clear what the outcome is. So this dependence on technology hasn't really helped. The second is most people, especially because of all the acquisitions and different regions, end up buying various tools that might be actually overlapping in whatever capabilities they have, right? So some division in Europe might have a tool that can do 3 things. You buy another tool here in the US that does 4 different things, but also those 3 things. But now you've essentially duplicated your effort, spend more money than you needed to, and still these two don't talk to each other because they're 2 different systems, right? And then the last one is more people-focused, right? Short of employees. We don't have a lot of OT security people. And so clearly, if you're good at your job, you're popular, next thing you know, you're jumping, right? Every 2 years or whatnot. So most of the companies that build their processes around a single person or a small group of people, as soon as one person changes or leaves that group, the whole thing falls apart. They're trained on something, the whole process is dependent on that person. Once that person leaves, the whole thing is now 5 years behind, right? That's the current state of the union. So why do I think resilience should be the focus and not security? Because for the past 15 plus years, we've been talking about OT security and we haven't seen a lot of changes, right? We still haven't seen a lot of companies adopting it. And we're not seeing a lot of people saying, yeah, we're somewhat in that maturity journey for OT security. So now I'm proposing that we should change the narrative to let's focus on resilience, right? So the first thing is, we all know this, right? Threat actor motivations are pretty high, whether it's ransomware people finding the easy targets or nation states. We talked about 2027 for the past day and a half. So there's a lot of that motivation from threat actors, and the costs are disproportionate. There's no person, no company in this country that can readily say, yeah, we're ready to take on China, because that's not what a company or an organization can do or can afford to do. So the process disruptions and downtime are bound to happen. Like a threat actor is constantly at us, so we will experience outages, we will experience downtime. So the question is not if, but when. It's not just me saying it. Practically everybody on the panel said that yesterday. So we're all agreeing that this is going to happen, right? Disruption is going to happen. So we have to be prepared. Now, resilience has a lot of different facets, right? So taking backups is one thing. I think the representative was talking about one portion of resilience, but resilience essentially means you're able to sustain some level of damage and still continue providing some minimal amount of production, right? Whether it's producing oil or generating power or being able to transport. These things change from industry to industry, vertical to vertical, but you are still able to somewhat perform. That's the whole point about being resilient, right? The second part of this is rapidly changing attack vectors means that the defense investments just can't keep up. I mean, think about just like what Ginger was saying before. If your only focus is on likelihood, is 90% good? Did you invest $1 billion and you got 90% good, 90% secure? Well, the next billion only gets you to 95. The next another billion might only get to 99. You can never get, the situation where you've removed all likelihood, right? Similarly, this rapidly changing attack vectors and new ways of getting into our critical stuff means that you can't be chasing the next fix, right? So you got to figure out how you can get attacked and still survive, right? That's the whole point. And then the last one being security can stop being know as a service. I mean, I've seen this t-shirt. I don't know if you've seen it before. Like people have know as a service behind them. Like, that's the typical IT or the OT security people, right? Because you go to them and you ask for something. Hey, I have this engineer come in and they need to copy some files. The first answer is no. What are they going to do next time? Anyone? They're just not going to ask you. So if you provide no as a service, they're not going to ask you. So we can be part of a solution if you're planning on being resilient. All right, the second section is it's impossible to build more layers of defense or apply fixes for vulnerabilities. Let's dig into this a little bit more. Chasing vulnerabilities has never worked in OT. It has never worked. Let's start there, right? Who here is in IT that has chased vulnerabilities for the past decade? Even IT is now suffering. Like Log4j showed us that you cannot be chasing vulnerabilities. If you wake up one day and you have this massive problem and you spend Christmas weekend fixing all of that, and before you could hit the bed, you now have to redo that all over again. And before you could say, yeah, I'm done a second round, you had to do that all over again over New Year's. That's not the way to survive this, right? That's not being resilient at all. And that was in IT. I mean, think about OT that has tens of thousands of vulnerabilities in each of those OT systems. So there's no way to keep on chasing vulnerabilities as your priority, right? The second is more layers of defense. I mean, historically, layers of defense was the key strategy in IT, right? We kind of appropriated the same thing in OT, but it adds so much complexity that cannot be managed. I mean, imagine a controls technician that historically, if something were to go wrong in the middle of the night, and usually that's the only way things happen in OT, right? It's Saturday morning at 2 a.m., something goes wrong. You send your technician. If it's blinking red light, they unplug it and replace it with another device with blinking green light, and you're good to go. Production is happy, right? You add more layers of defense, you make that networking, you make that authentication-based something, and now you need an engineer, it needs 3 hours to set this whole thing up. No one is happy, right? So more layers of defense necessarily don't mean fun. They just add more complexity that's not easy to manage. And then prevention focus far exceeds the marginal utility. And this is exactly the previous talk, right? Minimizing impact is a lot better at some point than thinking about reducing likelihood. So I don't have to repeat this because Ginger spent 30 minutes explaining that. So minimizing impact should be the focus in OT, not the likelihood reduction. And the third section here is significant differences amongst the industry verticals and dependencies, especially for those of you that are coming in new, right? OT security could be, hey, it's OT security. But those that have been in this space will tell you that it's not OT security. It's oil and gas OT security. It's power OT security. It's manufacturing. And even within manufacturing, it's not the same when it's continuous manufacturing versus something that's discrete, right? Things that go morning 8 to evening 4 o'clock, and you can do something in the night in discrete manufacturing, have a completely different perception of risk versus a refinery that doesn't take an outage for a decade, right? So these are two distinct things. But let's talk about the tightly coupled supply chains. The one thing that I didn't hear in the past couple of days was supply chain security, because I think that was overplayed in the past couple of years. But the reality is it's actually a bigger risk than ever before, right? because of cascading effects. I live in Houston. We will never forget the 2021 February outage, right? Because you thought you were resilient, you had all kinds of power backup, but every one of them failed at the same time because they were all related, right? If the pipes are frozen, the natural gas supply is cut off, the nuclear plant was in outage, right? The steam turbines were down, the wind wasn't blowing, so wind couldn't generate. So you have all these cascading effects in our world. And no universal solutions or regulations can be effective because we just talked about how OT security is different from vertical to vertical. So you can't have like a universal regulation to say, hey, let's start off doing this, right? It's not easy. And to our advantage though, regional differences are good, right? I lived in Canada for 5 years. BC, where I lived, had a lot of hydropower, right? Whereas Ontario had a lot of nuclear. So if you are able to somewhat exchange power, right? It's not that easy to exchange power from coast to coast, but if you have two distinct regions that have distinct production capabilities, even if one of them is down for whatever reason, right? You could take advantage of the other, right? It's an advantage that you have with regional diversity and keep up with all the grid connections. And the last one would be the solutions will be unique because what works in a distributed generation, right? Think about solar and distribution, like the regional generation, where your security might be isolation, right? Hey, isolate these things so the grid could be smaller and then sustain itself. To fuel diversity in transportation, right? You might have natural gas vehicles, you might have electric vehicles. So the type of resilience built on diversity can be different across regions, across fuel, across the type of generation. So there's a lot of ways we can think about resilience. So what do we do now that we all probably agree that resilience should be the focus? Sorry for the font sizes there, but the how of OT security, right? So what do we do in terms of people, process, and technologies to make this work? So the first thing is we need to have at least organization-wide focus on security, just like we did security, safety, and quality. If any of you have been in a plant environment, you would recognize a safety day or a safety week or a campaign, right? Same thing with a quality campaign. They've always had this for the past 30, 40 years, right? Or even more in some of the factories. We don't have a security day or a security week, right? The month of October, the month of the security month, that's all IT driven. I've never been into a refinery that proudly said, we're doing a security week or a security day, right? So we need to get that into the culture in the OT security space. The easiest way to get that going is create an informal OT security team, right? It can never be, I'm IT, I'm OT, each other when the worst thing happens, right? It has to be somewhat of an OT security team, whether it's formal or informal, right? If you have the budget, if you have the wherewithal to bring together a team of people that work on OT security, absolutely great. Even if not, get people representing from all these different groups and make it an informal group, right? The key is to enhance the mutual understanding of priorities, the problems being addressed, and the responsibilities, right? Like, why am I saying no to this, right? Explain that to the other so they can then advocate or explain their point of view so that you can then come up with a different system, right? The answer shouldn't be no, but hey, it's no because this. How would you solve it, right? Engineers might have a different idea. IT people might have a different idea. Overall, talking to each other helps. And then the operators being the first line of defense, people don't realize this, right? When we talk about OT, we're thinking automation, we're thinking controls, but the day-to-day operators are the first line of defense. Similarly, if you're hiring someone, HR and legal would be your first line of defense because the wrong person at the right job could mean all the difference, right? In terms of your OT security posture. The second thing is policies and humans first. I'm a technology guy. I'm an engineer. I have an MBA. I can always talk about technology and how these things work in the financial sense, but really all that is secondary to policies and humans, right? Like most people make the mistake of thinking technology is going to be the first thing to solve, but really you have to solve the policies and humans, right? add policies that work for the specific organization. What works for a company down the road doesn't necessarily work for you. You have to create policies that work for you, for your group, right? Training and awareness is still the low-hanging fruit. It won't be for long, right? 5 years from now, hopefully, most people are OT security aware and they're able to function somewhat. And, we talk about the collaboration, but right now it's still the low-hanging fruit. And then the tech investments need to align with the operations and the risk appetite. Again, risk is a very esoteric term. For a lot of people, it doesn't mean anything. It's probably being overused. But the reality is, again, like the previous talk was talking about, how finance and legal people, CFOs, they all think about risk every day, right? So work with them to make sure that the tech investments in the OT security space align with the organization's risk profile. And then the last one, we cannot wait for regulations. Absolutely not. Because like others have done in the past, right? You could wait till something happened, right? Like airplanes, getting into accidents or people dying because of automobile accidents, and then come up with the regulations, right? We've done this in the past. Like that's how safety regulations have historically been called as being written in blood. We're all trying to avoid that situation with OT security, right? Let's not wait for that. So in the past, when safety regulations were written in blood, there was a lot of negative impact, right? So again, coming from oil and gas, I always remember Piper Alpha in the mid-'80s, which was the reason why we have so many offshore regulations, right? Similarly, automobile and safety belts, they existed for like 3 decades before they were forced to be compliant, right? So click it and ticket didn't happen until like mid-'80s. And even then, people cut off the seat belts because they were like, no, thou shalt not tell me what I should do in my car, right? We should avoid that, obviously. Then the second piece is much more straightforward. Take advantage of new projects or upgrades to build a security framework and utilize it, right? Copy paste, okay, you can still do that, right? Copy paste exactly what works, but don't things that don't work, right? And that's more of an assessment, right? So upfront, when you're rebuilding a project, when you're doing a new upgrade, and at least ask the question, what could we do differently? Not ask, is it going to be more expensive? Well, that might be a different discussion for later, but ask the question, what would we do differently? And the last one is, this is my personal opinion. Security, when it's embedded in the organization and everybody is thinking and doing the right thing, that's when we won't talk about security anymore, right? Safety as a culture is already there, right? You literally just do things, right? And you walk into a power plant. In fact, most of you, because we're not regular power plant operators, when you go there once a year, whenever, right? You ask the question, hey, what do I bring, right? Do I need safety boots, hard hat, goggles? Do you need FRCs? Do you need the coveralls? Yes or no? And that's pretty much it. You just do it, right? Similarly, any kind of other, welding or whatever process you do, you just follow the policies, established policies, and you wear the safety gear, and then you just get on with your things. You're not thinking about safety. You're just doing it, right? Because fundamentally, the systems were put in place with safety in mind, and you had established processes. So you just follow what was established, right? That's where we should be. We're not there currently, but my hope is with more collaboration, with more kind of awareness, we'll get there with security as well. That's it, folks. That was the crux of my talk. Questions? Yes.
I just wondered, could I add a couple thoughts?
Sure.
On the need, I'm working backwards. On the need not wait for regulation. Everybody's heard me say a couple times. I'm a lawyer in the room.
Yeah.
I'll suggest one thing. A lot of people don't consider that you can legal contracts and legal activities typically use a risk transfer mechanism, but you can actually mitigate cyber risk through strong contracts and through legal action internally. So setting the parameters and requirements for your vendors and other people internally that you're working with can help you mitigate cyber risk at the front end, not just transfer the liability in the event of an incident.
Yeah.
Also, if you are thinking about it that way, you're going to be much better prepared when regulators come and want to regulate to actually effectively engage in the regulation process in a way that benefits you and helps you drive it in the direction you want it to go. And last, you shouldn't wait for regulation because the lawyers have arrived. I say at the front end of every presentation, and we are now regulating via litigation, which is what this. So that's not good for anybody. It doesn't benefit security. It just makes the lawyers rich. Not my kind of lawyers. On training and security awareness, as a risk mitigation, just a reminder to my technical folks, think about how to operationalize it outside of technical teams, because if you can make it, hey, here's an example of how, when you do your job, you impact the cybersecurity control or issue, not just here's a cyber risk and here's what it looks like. Security week, yes, we did have security week. So we integrated early on in SIP implementation, 1 week a year, where we pulled all the SMEs, legal, audit, everybody into a room, like a special initiative, and we went through all of our cybersecurity controls and processes and did all the updates with all the lessons learned from the year before in 1 week. So that's one way to do it in terms of just managing the program. And last, for anybody who's interested, just because I'm also operations, the wind turbines do blow. The problem in Texas is that the wind turbines in Texas are designed for high heat, not cold, whereas the wind turbines in Wisconsin are designed for cold. So when the freezing happens, but you're right, pipelines froze, that's the issue.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. I think there are so many facets of this, right? And again, you can learn from each other based on past experience. We just need to engage more. So thank you for the comment. Do you have any time questions anymore?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions, folks? Yes, sir.
So this is all great and fun, but it requires a lot of sort of internal convincing, right? As you mentioned, like you have to find the right people, you have to find the right stakeholders. In your experience, who are those people, right? Who are, whether it's the buyer of an external solution or of an internal initiative, who are the people to convince of this?
It has to come from top down, first of all, right? Any security initiative that is not blessed from the top is bound to fail, because this is not a foot soldier problem. This is a top down problem, right? So when the CEO, CFO, the board in general are inspiring and they are like, let's do it, right? Like all the other initiatives, right? It could be organizational transformation. It could be, changing who you are as a company, which includes, changing how you think about security, has to come from top down. And usually what I saw being successful is to find people that are interested and curious, right? Because a lot of people could be like, hey, my job is not security. I don't want to deal with this, right? And there are people that are like, hey, this is interesting. I think this is important. So find those people. And you need representation, because it cannot be all IT people. It cannot be all automation people. Like she was saying, it is the whole organization, right? So you need representation from operators, from controls, from maintenance, from legal, from HR. So more often than not, you might not be able to find everyone in the same go. But again, that's part of your hiring, right? So when you have a chance to replace someone, find someone that's curious and be part of that security conversation. So in general, it has to be from each department. At least you need a representation, because those people will believe a fellow legal person, a fellow operator, more so than someone from outside of the division. That's why you need a lot more from each group.
Thanks. If you have any more questions,
yeah, I'm around. So yeah, thank you. Appreciate it, folks.
Thanks.